All right, so today we're diving into a book that tends to, well, stir up some strong opinions. The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene.
Yeah, this one's definitely not your typical self-help, feel-good kind of read.
Definitely not. But that's kind of what we like to do here, get into the nitty-gritty of these thought-provoking, maybe even controversial ideas. And this book, it pulls from all these historical figures, right? Like, we're talking military masterminds, cunning politicians, seducers, even con artists.
The whole spectrum. And the common thread. Well, Greene argues there are certain actions, certain moves, that pretty consistently increase a person's power, while others kind of lead to, their downfall.
Exactly. So we're not here to say, hey, go out and use these laws to manipulate everyone around you.
Right, not a how-to guide.
But understanding these principles, even just recognizing them when they're at play, it gives you this new lens to view the world through, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, and I think that's especially valuable when you're talking about power dynamics, which, let's face it, are pretty much everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah. So we're going to go through a bunch of these laws pretty quickly today, really getting to the core of each one, just to give everyone a solid understanding of what Greene's getting at.
A crash course in the less glamorous side of human nature, maybe.
You could say that. Okay, let's jump right into Law 1. Never outshine the master. What's the gist here?
So the basic idea, and this might sound kind of counterintuitive, is that you never want to make your superiors feel, threatened or less competent than you.
Even if you are more competent.
Well, yeah, in some cases. Because here's the thing. People in positions of power, they really need to feel secure in that power.
Makes sense, right? If someone's coming in and making you look bad, you're not going to feel very good about it.
Exactly. So if you're constantly showing off your talents and making your boss look, less intelligent or capable, you're basically asking for trouble.
And that can have some pretty serious consequences, like in the case of Nicolas Fouquet.
Ah, Fouquet. Yeah, he was the finance minister to Louis XIV, King of France.
Yeah.
And he made the mistake of, building this absolute extravagant estate, probably even more impressive than the king's palaces at the time.
Showing up the king, that's a bold move.
Yeah, not a wise one. Louis, needless to say, was not happy. Fouquet ended up arrested and imprisoned for life.
So much for that fancy estate.
Yeah. And Louis, to really rub it in, he hired this guy named Colbert, who was known for being super frugal, to oversee the construction of Versailles, which basically became the most magnificent palace in Europe.
A power move if there ever was one.
Totally. And the takeaway here is that sometimes it's more strategic to make your superiors feel good about themselves, even if it means kind of downplaying your own achievements.
Letting them take the credit.
Exactly. It can be a subtle but very effective way to navigate those power dynamics.
Okay, Law 2. Never put too much trust in friends. Learn how to use enemies. This one sounds kind of harsh now.
It does, yeah. But Greene's argument is basically that friends, especially if they're in a similar field or competing for the same resources, can become, envious.
Envious of your success.
Exactly. And that envy, it can lead to betrayal, backstabbing, all that fun stuff.
So you're saying it's safer to keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
In a sense, yeah. Because former enemies, they often have more to prove, so they might be more loyal, more eager to please.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
And history's full of examples of this, both good and bad. Like, remember Michael III, the Byzantine emperor?
I can't say I'm super familiar with Byzantine history.
Well, he trusted his best friend, Basilius, to be his advisor, even though the guy had zero political experience. And what happened? Basilius ended up having Michael murdered and taking the throne for himself.
Ouch. Not a great endorsement for trusting your friends.
Not really, no. But then you have someone like Emperor Song of China, who did the opposite. When he became emperor, he had all these powerful generals who, could have potentially challenged his rule.
Right, a classic scenario.
So what does he do? He throws this big banquet, invites them all, and basically offers them these really cushy retirement packages full of riches and honors in exchange for giving up their commands.
So he neutralized the threat by, being super generous.
Exactly. He recognized that those generals were probably scared of being purged, so he gave them a way out that made them feel good about themselves and at the same time secured his own position.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And then there's Mao Zedong, who had a really interesting perspective on the Japanese invasion during World War II.
Not exactly something you'd think of as an opportunity.
Right. But Mao saw it as a chance to train and harden his communist forces against a formidable enemy. And that experience ultimately proved invaluable when they fought against the nationalists later on.
So even your enemies can be useful.
In a way, yeah. It's all about recognizing the potential advantages and disadvantages of different relationships and acting strategically.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack already. But let's move on to Law 3. Conceal your intentions. This one seems pretty self-explanatory, right?
On the surface, yeah. But it's more than just being secretive. It's about keeping your opponents guessing, making them unsure of your next move.
Keeping them off balance.
Exactly. Because if people know what you're going to do, they can easily counter you. But if you're unpredictable, if you're able to create a sense of mystery around your actions, you have a huge advantage.
Like a magician with a good trick.
Yeah, kind of. A great example of this is Yellow Kid Whale, one of the most notorious con artists of the 20th century.
I've heard of him. Wasn't he involved in some pretty elaborate schemes?
Oh, absolutely. In one of his cons, he was trying to sell this lodge to some guy, but the lodge was basically falling apart.
Not exactly a selling point.
No, definitely not. So to distract the buyer from that, Whale had this boxer on hand, shadowboxing and looking all impressive, even though the guy was actually in terrible shape.
The distraction tactic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also had all these fancy-looking financiers hanging around, just to create an illusion of legitimacy.
So the buyer was basically surrounded by this carefully constructed facade.
Yeah, and it worked. Weil was a master of misdirection, of creating these elaborate smoke screens to hide his true intentions.
And you've got another example too, right? Something about an emperor and a warlord.
Oh, right. Emperor Selassie of Ethiopia.
All right.
He was dealing with this rebellious warlord named Bolcha, who was causing all sorts of trouble.
That's like a headache.
Yeah, a big one.
Yeah.
So Selassie invited Bolcha to this banquet, seemingly as a gesture of good faith. He even allowed Bolcha to bring his personal bodyguard, which made it seem like Bolcha was in control.
But he wasn't.
Nope. While everyone was at the banquet, Selassie's forces were busy disarming Bolcha's troops elsewhere.
That's some next-level strategy.
Totally. And it shows that sometimes the best way to conceal your intentions is to create this atmosphere of normalcy, of like everything's fine, nothing to see here, while you're actually working behind the scenes.
So don't tip your hand.
Exactly.
All right, Law 4. Always say less than necessary. Now this one seems a little odd, right? I mean, we live in a world where everyone's constantly trying to get their voice heard.
True. But Green argues that there's power in restraint, in carefully choosing your words.
So it's not about being silent all the time.
No, not necessarily. It's about saying what needs to be said, and nothing more. Because when you talk too much, you risk revealing your weaknesses, your insecurities.
You become more predictable.
Exactly. And predictability is the enemy of power. But when you say less, your words carry more weight. People pay attention.
They have to fill in the blanks themselves.
Yeah. And that creates a sense of mystery, of intrigue. It makes you seem more powerful, more in control.
So like think before you speak.
Think before you speak, and then maybe think again.
Okay, so who's a good example of this? Someone who really embodied the less is more philosophy.
Well, you could look at someone like Louis XIV again. He was known for being very calculated in his speech, never saying more than was absolutely necessary.
So he cultivated this aura of mystery and power through his silence.
Exactly. And then there's Coriolanus, a Roman general who, well, let's just say he didn't quite get the memo about saying less.
What happened there?
He was trying to become consul, which was a very powerful position in Rome. But in his first speech to the people, he kind of bombed.
Couldn't connect with the audience.
Yeah, something like that.
Ah.
So he decided to give a second speech, thinking he could win them over with, more words. But the speech ended up being super long and arrogant, and it just alienated people even more.
So he doubled down on the wrong strategy.
Yeah, and it cost him the election. The lesson here is that sometimes it's better to leave people wanting more, to let your actions speak louder than your words.
Okay, that makes sense. So, Law 5. So much depends on reputation guard with your life. I mean, this one's pretty universal, right? Your reputation matters in any field.
Absolutely. It's like this invisible currency that precedes you everywhere you go.
It shapes how people perceive you before they even meet you.
Exactly. A good reputation can open doors, attract allies, and even intimidate your rivals. But a bad reputation? Well, that could pretty much ruin you.
So how do you build and protect a good reputation?
It's a combination of things. You got to be consistent in your actions, always strive for excellence, and be mindful of how you present yourself to the world.
Like, even small things can matter.
Oh, yeah. Because remember, people are constantly watching, judging, and gossiping. And once a negative perception takes hold, it can be really hard to shake.
And history's full of examples of people whose reputations made or broke them.
There's tons of examples. Like P.T. Barnum, the famous showman, Early on, he had a tough time buying the American Museum because, well, his reputation wasn't exactly stellar at the time.
So he had to work hard to build trust and credibility.
Exactly. And then there's this guy named Mi Zhuxia, a favorite of a Chinese ruler. He was initially seen as this kind and loving figure, but then some jealous courtiers started spreading rumors about him.
Trying to sabotage his reputation?
Yeah, and it worked. The ruler started to see Mi Zhuxia's actions in a totally different light, even though he hadn't actually changed his behavior.
Just goes to show how fragile a reputation can be.
Totally. And then you have guys like Baldassare Castiglione, who literally wrote a book on how courtiers should behave and cultivate a certain image.
So he was all about like personal branding, even back then.
Basically, yeah. And then you have Thomas Edison, who was a master at promoting himself and his inventions.
He knew the power of public perception.
Absolutely. And sometimes that meant overshadowing his rivals, like Nikola Tesla, who was arguably just as brilliant, but not as good at self-promotion.
So reputation isn't just about being good at what you do. It's also about how you present yourself to the world.
Precisely. And then you have figures like Pietro Aretino, who became famous by writing these really scandalous satirical poems that even mocked the Pope.
Not exactly playing it safe.
Nope, but it got him noticed. And then there's Mata Hari, the exotic dancer and alleged spy, who built her whole career on creating this mysterious and alluring persona.
So it's about crafting an image that resonates with people.
Yeah. And sometimes that image is based on truth, and sometimes it's, well, a little more fabricated. But the point is, you got to be strategic about it.
Right. Actively manage your reputation.
Exactly.
Law 6, court attention at all cost. Now, this one seems like a natural extension of the last law, right? If you want to build a reputation, you got to get noticed.
You got it. In a world where everyone's screaming for attention, the ones who stand out, the ones who create a spectacle, they're the ones who gain power.
It's all about being memorable, right? Making an impact.
Exactly. Because think about it. If nobody knows who you are, what you've done, what you stand for, how can you possibly wield any influence?
You're just another face in the crowd.
Exactly. And nobody listens to the face in the crowd. So you got to find a way to make yourself bigger, bolder, more interesting.
And sometimes that means being a little controversial, even pushing the boundaries of good taste, like P.T. Barnum did.
Barnum was a master of this. He understood that people love a good spectacle, even if it's a little outlandish, a little deceptive, and he embraced that.
He leaned into his reputation as a showman.
Yeah. And in his autobiography, he even revealed some of his tricks, which actually made him even more popular.
Because people appreciated his honesty, his willingness to pull back the curtain.
Exactly. And it reinforced his image as this larger-than-life character. So the takeaway here is, don't be afraid to be bold, to be different, to court attention.
But do it strategically, right?
Of course, strategically. You don't want to just be a random noisemaker. You got to have a purpose, a message, an image you're trying to cultivate.
Right. Make people remember you for the right reasons.
Exactly.
Law 7, get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. Now, this one might raise some eyebrows, ethically speaking.
It can, yeah. But purely from a power dynamics perspective, it's incredibly effective.
So the idea is to leverage other people's talents and efforts to advance your own goals.
Precisely. Because let's face it, nobody can do everything themselves, right?
Yeah.
We all have our strengths and weaknesses.
So it's about being a good delegator, finding the right people for the right tasks.
That's part of it, yeah. But it's also about being smart about how you present those accomplishments. You want to make sure that you're the one getting the recognition, the credit for the final product.
Even if other people did the heavy lifting.
Well, you want to be careful about how you do it, of course. You don't want to be blatantly stealing credit from people.
Right. That's going to backfire pretty quickly.
Definitely. It's more about subtly positioning yourself as the leader, the mastermind behind the operation.
So it's like you're the conductor of the orchestra and everyone else is playing their instruments.
A good analogy. And like a conductor, you need to have a vision, a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve.
But you don't necessarily need to be the one playing every single instrument.
Exactly. And by surrounding yourself with talented people and leveraging their skills, you can accomplish way more than you ever could on your own.
Okay, so Law 8. Make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. This sounds like it's all about control, right?
Very much so. The idea here is that when you can force your opponents to come to you, to negotiate on your terms, you inherently have the upper hand.
Because you're dictating the terms of engagement.
Precisely. You're in your own territory, you set the rules, and you're more likely to get what you want.
And how do you do that? How do you make people come to you?
Well, sometimes it's a matter of simply being patient, waiting for the right moment to strike.
Biding your time.
Exactly. But other times you might need to use a little bait, something to entice them, to lure them in.
So like dangling a carrot in front of them.
Exactly. A good example of this is Talleyrand, the French diplomat who played a major role in European politics for decades.
Talleyrand, he was a pretty cunning guy, right?
Oh, incredibly so. And he was a master at manipulating situations to his advantage. So after Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France, Talleyrand was tasked with dealing with him.
That must have been a tough job.
Yeah. Napoleon was not an easy guy to handle. But Talleyrand, instead of trying to directly confront him, he basically created a situation that would lure Napoleon back into a vulnerable position.
How did he do that?
Well, he knew that Napoleon was incredibly ambitious.
Yeah.
That he craved power and glory.
Classic Napoleon.
Right. So Talleyrand essentially let Napoleon believe that he could regain his former glory, that he could conquer Europe again. And Napoleon, blinded by his own ambition, took the bait.
And walked right into Talleyrand's trap.
Exactly. And it ultimately led to Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. So the lesson here is that sometimes the best way to win is to let your opponent think they're in control while you're actually pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Law 9. Win through your actions, never through argument. This one seems pretty straightforward, right? Actions speak louder than words.
It does, yeah. But it's more than just a catchy phrase. It's about understanding that arguments are often counterproductive, especially when you're dealing with people who are resistant to change.
Because arguing just makes them more entrenched in their position.
Exactly. It triggers their defensiveness. And they're less likely to listen to you, even if you have a valid point.
So instead of trying to convince people with logic and reason, you should just show them.
Precisely. Let your actions speak for themselves. Because actions are undeniable. They have a tangible impact.
And people are more likely to believe what they see with their own eyes.
Absolutely. And a great example of this is Michelangelo and the Statue of David.
Okay, yeah, I know that statue.
It's one of the most famous sculptures in the world, right? But it almost didn't happen.
Why not?
Well, the city of Florence had this huge block of marble that had been abandoned for years, damaged and considered useless. Nobody knew what to do with it.
Until Michelangelo came along.
Right. And instead of trying to argue with the city officials about the potential of the marble, he simply started sculpting.
He let his work speak for itself.
Exactly. And the result, well, it's a masterpiece. And it proved that Michelangelo was a genius, far more effectively than any words could have.
So sometimes the best way to win an argument is to not have one at all.
Precisely. Just focus on delivering results, on letting your actions speak for themselves.
Law 10. Infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. This one sounds a little, callous, maybe.
Yeah, it can come across that way. But the idea is that negativity and misfortune are contagious. And if you spend too much time around people who are constantly complaining or who always seem to be having bad luck, it can start to rub off on you.
So misery loves company.
In a way, yeah. And it's not about being heartless or abandoning your friends when they're going through a tough time. It's more about recognizing that sometimes you need to protect your own mental and emotional well-being.
You can't help someone else if you're drowning yourself.
Exactly. And a good example of this is Ludwig III of Bavaria, who became infatuated with this dancer named Lola Montez.
I've heard of her. She was quite a character. Right?
Oh, absolutely. She was known for being incredibly beautiful and charming, but also very volatile and controversial.
A dangerous combination.
Definitely. And Ludwig became so obsessed with her that he basically ignored all of his other responsibilities, his advisors, even his own people.
Putting all his eggs in one basket.
Yeah. And Lola's influence over him led to a lot of political unrest, public scandals, the whole 9 yards.
Not exactly the outcome you want as a king.
No, definitely not. And ultimately, Ludwig had to abdicate the throne because of the backlash.
So Lola's negativity, her instability, it basically infected Ludwig and brought him down.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the takeaway here is that you got to be careful about who you surround yourself with, especially when you're in a position of power, because negativity can spread like a virus.
Okay, Law 11. Learn to keep people dependent on you. Now, this one sounds a bit manipulative, doesn't it?
It can, yeah. But it's really about creating a situation where your skills, your knowledge, your connections are so valuable to other people that they can't afford to lose you.
Making yourself indispensable.
Exactly. Because when you're indispensable, you have leverage. People need you, they rely on you, and that gives you power.
And how do you become indispensable?
It's different for every situation, of course. But it often involves developing a unique skill set, cultivating valuable relationships, or having access to information that other people don't have.
So it's about making yourself the go-to person for something specific.
Exactly. And a great example of this is the Rothschild family, who basically dominated European finance for centuries.
They were incredibly wealthy and powerful, right?
Oh yeah, immensely so. And one of the keys to their success was their information network. They had couriers all over Europe, bringing them news and financial data faster than anyone else.
So they were always one step ahead of the game.
Exactly. And they also used a private code to communicate, which made it almost impossible for anyone to intercept their messages.
Talk about strategic communication.
Totally. And this information network made them indispensable to governments, businesses, everyone. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, and that gave them incredible power.
So knowledge is power, as they say.
Very much so. And in the Rothschilds' case, that knowledge translated into immense wealth and influence.
Law 12. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. This one sounds a little bit like a contradiction, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But it's all about playing the long game, about using acts of kindness and sincerity to build trust, even if your ultimate goal is to, well, maybe take advantage of that trust later on.
So it's like a Trojan horse tactic.
In a way, yeah. Because when someone does something nice for you, especially unexpectedly, it lowers your guard, makes you more likely to see them in a positive light.
And less likely to suspect their motives.
Exactly. And a great example of this is Victor Lustig, the con artist we talked about earlier.
The lodge guy.
Yeah, that's him. So Lustig was trying to con Al Capone, which, not an easy feat.
Not someone you want to mess with.
Definitely not. So Lustig approached Capone with this scheme that involved investing some money, but it was all a fake.
So he was going to take Capone's money and run.
Exactly. But here's the twist. Lustig took Capone's money, held onto it for a couple of months, and then returned it all, saying the deal had fallen through.
Really? Why would he do that?
Because he knew that by returning the money, he would gain Capone's trust. And Capone, thinking Lustig was an honest guy, ended up giving him even more money for a bigger con later on.
So it was like an investment in future deception.
Precisely. And it shows that sometimes a little bit of honesty and generosity can go a long way, especially if you're trying to manipulate someone.
Law 13. When asking for help, appeal to people's self-interest, never to their mercy or gratitude. This one seems like a basic principle of human psychology, right?
It is, yeah. People are inherently self-interested. They're motivated by what benefits them, what helps them achieve their own goals.
So if you want someone to do something for you, you got to show them how it's in their best interest to do it.
Exactly. Don't rely on guilt trips or appeals to their better nature. Frame your request in a way that highlights the benefits they'll receive, the value they'll gain.
So make it a win-win situation.
Precisely. And a good example of this is the Corinthian ambassador who went to Athens to try and persuade them not to ally with Corcyra.
A diplomatic mission.
Yeah. But instead of focusing on the potential benefits of an alliance with Corinth, he made the mistake of reminding the Athenians of all the favors Corinth had done for them in the past.
Appealing to their sense of gratitude.
Exactly. But it backfired. The Athenians were more interested in what Corinth could offer them in the present, not what they'd done in the past.
Past favors don't hold much weight in politics.
Nope. And then you have Joseph Duveen, the art dealer, who was a master at appealing to people's self-interest.
How so?
Well, he wanted to sell art to Andrew Mellon, who was this incredibly wealthy banker and art collector. So Duveen did his research. He learned everything he could about Mellon's tastes, his preferences, his aspirations.
Tailoring his pitch to the specific client.
Exactly. And he even started collecting the same kind of art that Mellon liked, just to create this sense of shared taste, of common ground.
So Mellon would feel like he was dealing with a kindred spirit.
Precisely. And it worked. Mellon ended up buying tons of art from Duveen because he felt like Duveen understood him, that he was helping him build a collection that reflected his own refined taste.
So it's all about finding that point of connection, that shared interest that motivates the other person.
Exactly. And framing your request in a way that makes it clear how it benefits them.
Law 14. Pose as a friend, work as a spy. This one sounds a little sneaky, no?
It can be, yeah. But it's about recognizing that information is power. And sometimes the best way to get that information is to get close to your rivals, to gain their trust.
So playing the long game again?
Very much so. Because when people think you're their friend, they're more likely to let their guard down, to reveal their secrets, their weaknesses.
And you can use that information to your advantage.
Exactly. Cesare Borgia, the Italian Renaissance prince, was a master of this. He had a network of spies and informants, and he was always gathering information about his enemies.
Keeping his ear to the ground.
Absolutely. And in one instance, he used information gleaned from a confession to expose a plot against him by his own generals.
So he turned their own treachery against them.
Precisely, and he had them all arrested and executed. The takeaway here is that knowledge is a weapon. And sometimes the best way to acquire that weapon is to befriend your enemies, to get them to confide in you.
But do it discreetly, right?
Of course, discreetly. You don't want them to know what you're really up to.
Law 15.
There we
Crush
go.
your enemy. Totally. This one sounds pretty ruthless, even a bit scary.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But Green's argument is that when you're dealing with a serious threat, a true enemy, you can't afford to show mercy.
Because any sign of weakness will be exploited.
Exactly. Leaving even a small ember burning can allow the fire to reignite. And a wounded enemy is often more dangerous than a healthy one because they're driven by revenge.
So it's a matter of self-preservation almost.
In a way, yeah. And history's full of examples of leaders who underestimated their enemies and paid the price. Like Shang Yu, the Chinese general who fought against Liu Bang for control of China.
This was a long time ago, right?
Yeah, over 2,000 years ago. But the lessons are still relevant. So Shang Yu had Liu Bang trapped at one point, and he could have easily killed him.
But he didn't.
Nope. He showed mercy, let Liu Bang go. And Liu Bang used that opportunity to regroup, rebuild his forces, and eventually defeat Shang Yu.
So Xiang Yu's mercy was his undoing.
Exactly. And then you have Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as emperor.
She must have been pretty tough.
Oh, she was ruthless.
Yeah.
She consolidated her power by eliminating anyone who posed a threat, even members of her own family. She understood that to truly secure her position, she couldn't afford to leave any potential rivals standing.
So it's a very Machiavellian approach, right? The ends justify the means.
In a way, yeah. But it highlights the importance of being decisive and uncompromising when dealing with serious threats.
Okay, Law 16. Use absence to increase respect and honor. Now, this one seems counterintuitive. I mean, shouldn't you be present to make an impact?
It's tempting to think so, yeah. But think about it this way. When something is scarce, it becomes more valuable.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to people. If you're constantly around, always available, people start to take you for granted.
You become less special.
Precisely. But if you strategically withdraw, make yourself scarce, people start to miss you.
They wonder where you've gone, what you're doing.
Exactly. And that absence can actually increase their respect and admiration for you.
So it's about creating a sense of mystery, of intrigue.
Yeah. And a good example of this is Deioces, who was chosen to be the first king of the Medes, an ancient Iranian people.
How did he use absence to his advantage?
Well, he was initially a judge, and he was known for being fair and just.
So he had a good reputation.
Yeah. But he realized that by being constantly available, he was actually diminishing his own authority.
People were becoming too familiar with him.
Exactly. So he decided to withdraw from public life, to isolate himself.
A strategic retreat.
Exactly. And the Medes, who had grown accustomed to his wise judgments, started to miss him terribly.
They realized how valuable he was when he was gone.
Precisely. And eventually they begged him to come back and rule them.
So he got what he wanted by playing hard to get.
In a way, yeah. And it shows that sometimes stepping back can actually be the best way to move forward.
Okay, Law 17. Keep others in suspended terror. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. This one sounds kind of intense, even a little bit manipulative.
It can be, yeah. But the idea here is that predictability breeds complacency. If people know what to expect from you, they can easily counter you, outmaneuver you.
So you're going to keep them guessing.
Exactly. By being unpredictable, by acting in ways that defy expectations, you keep your opponents off balance, unsure of how to react.
It's like a psychological advantage.
Very much so. And a great example of this is Bobby Fischer, the chess prodigy who became world champion.
Fischer, he was known for being pretty eccentric, right?
Oh, incredibly so. And he used that eccentricity to his advantage. During his matches, he would often do things that seemed completely irrational, like making seemingly bad moves, showing up late, even demanding that the game be moved to a different location.
So he was playing mind games with his opponents.
Absolutely. And it worked. His opponents, like Boris Spassky, who he defeated for the world championship, were thrown off by Fischer's unpredictability. They couldn't figure out his strategy, and it gave Fischer a psychological edge.
So sometimes it pays to be a little bit crazy.
Well, not literally crazy, but definitely unpredictable. You got to find ways to disrupt people's expectations, to keep them on their toes.
Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. Now,